Voorkomen is beter dan genezen. En het Rode Kruis zag al begin deze eeuw in dat natuurrampen steeds vaker ook mede werden veroorzaakt door klimaatverandering. En daardoor werd het Internationale Klimaatcentrum opgericht. En over hoe dat dan werkt en over of je daarmee ook kan zorgen dat je rampen kan voorkomen, kan verkleinen. En over wat er veranderd is de afgelopen jaren. Daar geef ik nu het woord aan Maarten van Aalst, directeur van dit klimaatcentrum.
I'll be presenting a few results from the World Disasters Report that we launched a few months ago, which was actually themed around climate. So it's an annual report that the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies publishes, but this one was not by accident devoted to the climate crisis, because it is starting to influence our disaster statistics more and more strongly. My name is Maarten van Aalst. As noted, I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a reference center for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent system on climate. In practice, that means that we support that whole international system. My team is about 45 people based around the world, but we've been initiated in the Netherlands by Prinses Margriet, among others, who is also the one to which my chair at University of Twente is devoted. So I'm also a part-time professor of climate and disaster resilience at Ipcc, which is an institute at the University of Twente, very much focused also on these global challenges and especially the capacity building in more vulnerable countries to deal with rising risks. In addition to those roles, or actually as part of those roles in a way, I'm also a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Ipcc, which releases the big assessment reports every few years with the state of the science on climate. My role there in particular is at the moment for the 6th assessment report, which is coming out next year. And I'm coordinating the assessment of what's called the key risks. So what have we seen so far about how climate change is hitting us already, and what are our projections for the coming years and decades? Of course, that has an intimate connection to the world of disasters and the Red Cross, which I'll be focusing on in this presentation, but feel free to ask any questions that would zoom out to that perspective on the wider set of risks facing the world at large. To give you, let's see how I move to the next slide here. To give you a quick sense, when we started this climate center, as Sietske noted in the early 2000s, the real question coming to us all the time was, why is the Red Cross suddenly worried about climate change? Do you care about polar bears in 2100? Are you becoming a Greenpeace telling us to change our behavior and turn off our lights? That was partly because at the time there was still this ongoing debate about whether climate change has an anthropogenic component. There was also at the time a lot of focus just on that greenhouse gas emission side of the picture, which of course is still there. But at the time, also talking about adaptation to climate change, dealing with changing risks was a bit, well, almost like giving up on addressing the root causes of the problem. But we were starting to see the initial signs that it was going to hit our work, and it was already starting to have an effect on our reality in practice. So we were concerned and at least wanted to get the science to understand what it meant for our practice. So that interface between science and practice is still a lot of our work. We have that link to the international scientific community, but also try and translate that into usable information that can be employed by our 193 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world, as well as our big international operations of both the Disaster Risk Management Society, the International Federation of the Red Cross, and also our work in conflicts by the International Committee of the Red Cross. There's also a very strong policy interface, so that's the third pillar. We're bringing that experience of what we know about the science of climate change meets our practice on the ground and what we're seeing already in disaster statistics and health statistics around the world to the policy world, which has been very segmented from the world of disaster and basic health, for instance, that the Red Cross would typically live in, but is becoming closer and closer, more closely and closely linked. So we represent the International Federation of the Red Cross, for instance, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in that sense, for instance, I'm now working very closely with Alok Sharma, the president of the next negotiating round of this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, because they also realize that an ambitious package for the Paris Agreement needs to involve something related to the emissions, but also something to help especially the most vulnerable countries adapt to a changing climate, but also even dealing with the impacts that we already see today. And this was intended to be a little bit of a pun, a joke for floods actually entering Paris. And it said something like, we'll always be there to save you if needed, but we'd much rather prevent that from being necessary. Thereby also underlining the Red Cross messages to that Paris negotiating round at the time, which resulted in the Paris Agreement. We need ambitious reductions of greenhouse gases, but also we need to start preparing our world for the rising risk and then actually preventing the floods from entering our streets. If it would come to it, we also need to be ready to respond, having a lifeboat on our Parisian balcony. This was really intended as a joke, conversation starter, but just a few months later, this is what we saw in the streets of Paris. There were lifeboats needed to save people in the streets of Paris. They did evacuate the ground floor of the Louvre Museum to safeguard their art. And we were able to calculate, so this is also a new piece of science that we're very closely involved in and that might be of interest to media in the Netherlands as well. We're increasingly able to point to the fingerprint of climate change in these individual disaster events. So this was one example where climate change has increased the chances of this amount of extreme rainfall by 40%. In the case of heat waves in the Netherlands, for instance, the most deadly disaster of last year, that risk has increased about tenfold. So those are, in some cases, pretty dramatic percentages. I also want to emphasize the element of surprise. So in the case of Paris, the reason this became such a bad flood event was, on the one hand, the unexpected amount of rainfall, but it was also in June. And in June, Paris was actually preparing for what is now an increasingly hot and dry summer. So the reservoirs upstream of Paris had been filled to the max to have water ready for that summer. And in spring, when they were expecting snow melt from the Alps and also the spring storms that would bring a lot of rainfall that was expected earlier in the year, the reservoirs would be empty and they would be used to store that water and flatten the curve of the water actually entering the city. That flexibility was not available because it was June and they were preparing for drought rather than flood. The sort of reverse story of the drought in the Netherlands that you might be hearing about later this lunch. Of course, this is still a well-prepared, rich country able to deal with these sort of consequences. You can only imagine how these surprises are playing out in the most vulnerable places around the world. And indeed, that's what we're seeing. In 2019, for instance, these are some of the statistics from this World Disasters Report. We counted over 200 disasters triggered by natural hazards, affecting about 100 million people. And the vast majority of those were climate and weather related. And this is a very consistent pattern where we've also seen that particularly the climate and weather related ones rise over the decades. So it's the lion's share. It's also the part that's been rising. And then, of course,
sorry, can I ask? Yeah. There were three colors in the graph. What do the three colors represent?
Oh, I'm sorry, that dropped off the slide. So it's the geophysical disasters, the biological disasters, so the disease outbreaks and so, and then in blue, the meteorological and climatological disasters, so the floods, droughts, storms. And what you can see is that that's the vast number, but it's also the type of disaster that has been rising most significantly. Of course, what we're also seeing is that those disasters don't come on their own. It's often not just one flood that is the problem, but it is the flood, for instance, in Somalia, coming in a region already affected by conflict, also coping with a locust infection, and now also with COVID hampering cross-border trade, putting even more pressure on food prices. So it's all those things together. And one of the challenges that we're seeing as a humanitarian organization dealing with these disasters, trying to better prevent those disasters, prepare for those disasters, is that there are big silos between the climate world, the disaster world, the long-term development world trying to lift people out of poverty, whereas actually all of these problems are very interrelated. And the last year has been the perfect illustration of that. One graphic, for instance, from this World Disasters Report looked at how many disasters we already saw happening during COVID in those first 6 months, where we counted over 100, impacting very large numbers of people, where the challenge of dealing with those disasters was, of course, much bigger now in times of COVID. And that, for instance, a very simple example of that is the cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh and India, where we evacuated literally millions of people. That evacuation saved tens of thousands of lives. In the 1970s, similar storms sometimes killed hundreds of thousands of people, and now we only lost 120 lives. But it was much more challenging to do that mass evacuation in these times of COVID, when we had to have either protective materials available in the shelters or enable the social distancing in those places. So that is a very practical example. The indirect effects are even bigger, where people are coping with the loss of livelihoods due to the immediate impact of a storm like this or a flood like this, while also coping with the economic impacts of the pandemic, of course. And this is an example from Uganda, a hospital ward destroyed by a landslide, and of course no longer available to treat patients also of the pandemic. Now, tomorrow will be worse. Here is one estimate that we published last year. We looked at the expected humanitarian needs by 2030 and by 2050. By 2050, this could be a doubling, depending on climate and development trends. So this is partly by 2050, we have a few climate scenarios that are starting to diverge. A lot of what's going to come our way is already unavoidable for the coming 2-3 decades, but some of it can be mitigated by reducing emissions. It also depends a lot on our development pathways. So if we see more people dipping into extreme poverty, and again, that's aggravated currently by the pandemic, then we will also see higher humanitarian needs. So all of these problems are interrelated. And of course, a very big differential vulnerability around the world, with countries like the Netherlands, a delta, on the one hand, highly vulnerable, on the other hand, quite able to adapt. Many other deltas, but also landlocked countries in Africa, for instance, already struggling more with the impacts, but especially also within those countries, disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable groups in those countries. Children and youth, urban poor, indigenous groups, older people, people with disabilities, women and girls, migrants and displaced persons. So we're seeing often the people that have contributed the least to the problem getting hit hardest. By the way, I should say that this applies to the most vulnerable and the poorest around the world. It to some extent also applies in the Netherlands. So I mentioned already that even for the last 2 years, in 2019 and 2020, a European heat wave was the most deadly disaster that we counted around the world. The Netherlands counted over 650 people excess mortality, so people dying that would not have died otherwise during our August heat wave just now. And those are also, of course, people already older and with chronic diseases. Just like with COVID, those are not people that would have died anyhow. They're sometimes people that could have lived several decades. And there's a question of how we care for people also in our society in the Netherlands. Also, this element of surprises. Heat waves in the Netherlands are for many people still considered a nice day at the beach, whereas actually we do face significant risks that we need to manage differently. So what can we do? Well, one question is, are we sufficiently climate smart? And that also applies to our international response. It applies to how individual countries and individual places are thinking about the changing risks that are coming. Of course, this is a bit of a joke about the international response, just thinking that all places are the same when we can just take a solution from one place to the other. But it is a bit of a symbol also, for instance, for the Netherlands, thinking about adaptation to climate change, primarily in terms of keeping the water out of a rising sea level, whereas actually what we need to be thinking about is also heat waves and droughts. And again, more on that later. The local context is often something that is ignored also when you're thinking about the problems from that global top level and thinking your way down from the global climate models. What actually matters is what is playing out locally and what the vulnerabilities there look like. So the second question is, are we acting before the crisis or waiting until it's too late? And again, I already mentioned this partly on the longest timescale speaks to the need to rapidly reduce emissions. We're in for very dire scenarios if we don't stay below the 2 or preferably the 1.5 degrees mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And that means a really drastic cut in emissions soon. But it also relates to how we deal with the shocks. And in many cases, we're getting better early warnings. The science is providing better information, but we're not applying that systematically enough. And in our own work to deal with disasters, we have made a major transition, partly in light of the rising risk due to climate change in the past decade, allowing us to use part of our humanitarian money for disaster response before the disaster hit. And this is something we're calling forecast-based financing, which is now happening in a large number of countries around the world, and not just by the Red Cross, but by a wider range of humanitarian agencies. And that is a real difference in the way we operate, where we can actually prevent suffering rather than just alleviate it after the fact. A critical challenge there is that the international climate finance that is starting to become available, and again, the promise in the Paris Agreement was 100 billion a year. We're not yet seeing that. The question is also, is that going to greenhouse gas mitigation and or adaptation? And that balance is a matter of debate. But the part that is there for adaptation, which is needed for those places that are hit hardest, is actually not reaching those most in need. So in the World Disasters Report, we looked at who are most vulnerable and where the money is going. And then we saw a pretty distinct mismatch with the highest per capita funding for climate change adaptation going to the places with the lowest vulnerability. The reason this is happening is that the countries with the highest vulnerability are actually the places that also suffer from other problems. So it's all these problems coming together. Countries like Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, you name them, Syria. They are also suffering from climate-related shocks. They're not making the news as often because the conflict is the dominant storyline in those places. But people in those countries, sometimes already moved away from their houses and away from their livelihoods by the conflict, are then also getting the climate-related shocks. That's actually where we need to think about how to strengthen their resilience, even in these very difficult circumstances. At the moment, our international rules, largely working through governments, of course, actually disadvantage people in these most vulnerable circumstances because their governments either don't reach all of the country or have other priorities than to fill in the forms for a global climate project. So this is a real mismatch, which means that some of the statistics I showed you earlier about how many people are hit and where we're seeing the rising concerns are not at the moment responded to by what we're putting in place in terms of climate change adaptation, including also the discussions we had at our summit here in the Netherlands a few weeks ago. Finally, I just wanted to highlight media opportunities for those of you in that world. One is that there are always disasters happening around the world, and we respond to most of them. We're increasingly also doing analysis on them to understand what the role of climate change in those individual disasters is, attribution of extreme events to climate change. So that is something, if you have those questions for particular events, don't hesitate to contact us. The second is the coming year, we will have lots of discussions on this road to Glasgow. What is the next big sort of summit moment like this moment I showed you before in Paris? What is it going to look like? Are we going to indeed raise our ambition? We're working closely with the UK presidency, who are the president of COP26, but are also presiding over the G7 this year, for instance. And one of the big questions that we're asking is not only what is the balance between greenhouse gas emissions reduction, adaptation, and even dealing with the impacts we already see, but also what is that transfer between rich and poor going to look like? And there's discussions of a sort of Marshall Plan-like thing of the order of hundreds of billions that would be an investment to actually create that more resilient world. A key question there is also how we connect that to the COVID crisis, of course, and the recovery funding that is available there. Finally, I wanted to highlight the Ipcc reports that will be coming out partly later this year, partly early next. Again, I have a close finger on the pulse. We'll be part of the negotiations with governments to finalize those summary for policymakers of those reports. So by the time those come out, don't hesitate to call on us for further information. And this is the link to the report I've been using some data from, in case some of you want to read more, as well as my contact details. Thank you.
Dankjewel, Maarten. Misschien als je je presentatie uit kunt doen, dan kunnen we iedereen weer even zien. Ja. Delen uitzetten. Ik wou nog aan jou vragen van, vind je dat de media op een goede manier erover bericht? Is het voldoende en klopt het ook?
Ik denk dat het nog... laat ik twee dingen zeggen. Ten eerste, ik vind dat de balans tussen de aandacht van de problemen hier en de problemen elders in de wereld is soms scheef. Dus bijvoorbeeld bij die klimaattop, die natuurlijk uiteindelijk ook ging over wat we als hele wereld als uitdagingen nu krijgen. Ik was heel blij dat ik kon optreden in dat televisieprogramma daar 's avonds. Maar dat is wel als onderdeel van een heel klein blokje internationaal. Als onderdeel van een hele grote zee van focus op Nederland. En dat is natuurlijk waar de voornaamste aandacht van Nederlandse lezers en kijkers naar uitgaat. Maar ik denk dat die context van wat er in de rest van de wereld gebeurt en hoe lastig het daar is, die kan zeker meer aandacht krijgen. Het tweede is dat in termen van de balans, de koppeling tussen wat we doen aan de broeikasgassen en wat we doen om ons aan te passen, vaak als een soort either-or gezien wordt. Terwijl ik denk dat we op dit moment gewoon geen keuze meer hebben. Het moet allebei. Het is ook niet een of-of. En juist voor de meest kwetsbare landen is het sterker nog alleen maar een en-en. En als wij als Nederland niet bereid zijn om kwetsbare landen erin te ondersteunen, gaan zij ook niet hun economische groei aanpassen om hun emissies te reduceren, die wij al gehad hebben en om onze economische groei te realiseren. Dus dat element, ook die zowel de ongelijkheid als ook ons verlicht eigen belang in zekere zin om daar een verantwoordelijkheid in te nemen, is van belang.
Hebben andere mensen nog vragen voor?
Nou, ik wil wel een vraag stellen en ik zie dat Mike een hand op heeft gestoken. Sietske, ik weet niet of jij die handjes kan zien, maar ik heb het in elk geval openstaan. Ik heb een vraag aan Maarten. Dat beeld van die vloedgolf door de straten van Parijs met die reddingboot aan de gevel, dat is natuurlijk visueel een heel sterk beeld. En ook hoe zeg je dat, die indigenous people die er altijd zo mooi kleurrijk uitzien. In hoeverre denk je dat media niet alleen feitelijk bericht kan geven voor dit soort dingen, maar ook een rol in de bewustwording kan spelen?
Ja, essentiële rol. En dan moeten ook juist die verhalen bij elkaar komen. Hè? Dus, dus wat we vaak heel frustrerend vinden is dat de wetenschap, de klimaatwetenschap, bijvoorbeeld de Ipcc Rapporten, die maken dan een analyse van de statistieken van de afgelopen decennia. Terwijl het moment dat er aandacht is op het moment dat er zo'n ramp gebeurt. Hè, en die de voorpagina haalt. En we moeten eigenlijk ook op dat moment de koppeling maken naar die grotere trends en die verhalen ook vertellen. En ja, de media zijn het kanaal waar op dat moment, als dat kleine window of opportunity voor die aandacht er is, om dat hele verhaal te vertellen.
Maaike, wil jij wat vragen?
Ja, ik moet altijd denken aan dat er een houding is geweest in de communicatiewereld, in ieder geval van de duurzame hoek, dat je niet mocht vertellen over de drama's, zeg maar. Je mocht niet, dat zouden mensen afschrikken en bang maken en dat zou averechts werken. Maar de urgentie is mede daardoor volgens mij niet doorgedrongen. En nog steeds willen we niet voldoende weten volgens mij wat er allemaal gebeurt in de wereld en waar wij dan verantwoordelijk voor zijn. Dat is gewoon niet heel duidelijk. Zelfs in het onderwijs van middelbare scholen komt dit nauwelijks aan bod. Van hoe duidelijk dit de link er is. En er komt nu net weer een nieuw curriculum voor lagere en middelbare scholen. En weer is duurzaamheid komt heel weinig aan bod. En dat is één onderdeeltje in burgerschap, maar echt weggestopt, zeg maar. Ik moet steeds denken aan hoe dat bij COVID nu gebeurt met corona. Dat daar de urgentie wordt zo duidelijk gemaakt en daarom gebeurt er ook wat. En hier wordt de urgentie gewoon niet duidelijk gemaakt. Maar ja, dat komt dus een beetje omdat er zo'n wet is, we mochten ze niet bang maken. Dus ik vraag me af of we niet in zo'n spiraal zitten en wat daaraan te doen is. Ik weet niet of dat een vraag is voor jou, Maarten, maar wel voor dit publiek volgens mij. Ja.
Nou, ik kan je wel mijn perspectief erop geven. Dus ten eerste, ik denk dat de klimaatjeugdbeweging daar een belangrijke rol in kan vervullen. Ik vind wel vaak dat vanuit hun perspectief het vaak gaat over wat voor soort wereld hebben wij over 20 of 30 jaar. En er zou wat mij betreft ook vanuit hun nog wat meer nadruk kunnen liggen op wat voor soort wereld zijn we nu aan het creëren, ook in termen van ongelijkheid in onze eigen samenleving, maar ook in de wereld als geheel. En ook wat voor wereld laat dat ons achter, hè? Ook in termen van spanningen in de wereld en noem maar op. Dus dat is één element. Maar bijvoorbeeld in de Rode Kruis jeugd vrijwilligers merken we ook dat die vraag er heel sterk is. Voor het Amerikaanse Rode Kruis bijvoorbeeld ook een reden om nu, ondanks de politieke gevoeligheid, zich veel meer op klimaat te richten. Dat is ook echt een vraag van hun jongere vrijwilligers. Het tweede is dat als wij het hebben over de rampen, ik denk dat het wel benoemd moet worden. Dus het zijn ook de momenten dat er uiteindelijk toch wel aandacht is. Hè? Met name die meest extreme dingen. En dan gaat het niet zozeer over wat voor afschuwelijke scenario's zouden we in 2050 kunnen hebben, maar ook wat zien we nu al. En dat is vaak ook waar er toch gewoon wel interesse is in wat zien we al en waar ligt dat aan. En dan ligt het vaak voor een stukje aan klimaat, maar voor een stukje ook aan andere fouten die we gemaakt hebben. Houston is een ander voorbeeld waar we het hebben uitgerekend. 100 miljard schade, 3 keer waarschijnlijker door klimaatverandering. Maar tegelijkertijd natuurlijk gewoon door hoe ongelooflijk stupide Houston zich in de loop van die decennia ontwikkeld heeft. Met al dat beton en geen aandacht voor het watermanagement. Dus dat gaat altijd samen. Dat biedt dus ook op een bepaalde manier oplossingen. Want als je dat slimmer had gedaan, dan had je dus ook een heleboel van die schade kunnen voorkomen. Dus ik vertel bijvoorbeeld over het verhaal van Bangladesh wat ik noemde. Ook het feit dat we daar nu 120 doden hadden in plaats van de 10.000 die we in de jaren 70 gehad zouden hebben. Die forecast-based financing die ik noemde. We worden echt slimmer in het beter gebruiken van informatie en daarmee ook het beter opvangen van de klappen. Tegelijkertijd, het water blijft stijgen en de nood wordt steeds hoger, dus we moeten ook steeds slimmer worden. Maar het kan wel een soort gebalanceerd verhaal zijn waar je ook een stuk van die oplossingen laat zien. Ook in Nederland met die hittegolven. Dus dan vaak ook, dan zeggen mensen, ja, god, hebben we eindelijk een leuke dag aan het strand, komen jullie weer zeuren over je hittegolven en klimaatverandering en noem maar op. Maar als je als je het cijfermatig onderbouwt, dus we besteden veel tijd aan die echte harde onderbouwing om ook op dat moment die harde cijfers te kunnen leveren. Maar ten tweede dan oplossingen biedt. Zo van die 650 doden, dat zijn deels gewoon mensen die uitdrogen. Dat zijn bejaarden die dorstprikkel niet voelen, die wij allemaal nog wel voelen. En die gewoon sloom worden door de hitte. Ja, die moet gewoon verteld worden dat ze 6 glazen water per dag moeten drinken. Of iemand moet even bij ze langs gaan. Dat is heel simpel en dat kost bijna niks. Maar we kunnen er een enorm verschil mee maken. Dat is op een bepaalde manier ook wel weer empowering voor mensen.
Maarten, dankjewel voor dit mooie bruggetje.